Can literary fiction be unputdownable? I think when most people think about unputdownable books, they probably tend to think about genre fiction. And let's face it, people who are willing to invest their time reading literary fiction are not necessarily in search of the next big page-turner. But I don't think that a deep and enriching reading experience should necessarily be a slog. I find some of the best literary novels I read hard to put down, and in this video, I want to share with you some recommendations of literary fiction that I find extremely compelling. My first recommendation is Possession by AS Byatt, which is quite a literary tour de force. But before I explain why, let's see what this novel is about. So in Possession, two young English academics research the work of two famous Victorian poets named Randolph Henry Ashe and Christabel Lamotte, and they discovered that those two poets had a love affair. Now, if you haven't heard of those two poets, do not worry because they are fictional. A.S. Byatt made them up for her novel. And not only did Byatt make them up, but she also wrote poetry as both of them for this novel. Possession is set in modern-day Britain and in the 19th century. But what makes this novel a literary tour de force is that it incorporates letters, poems, and diary entries in the narrative, and it does so masterfully. A.S. Byatt uses many different writing styles in this novel, and she does it so well that the reader wonders whether Ashe and Lamotte actually existed, and whether she's just reproducing the writing here. What makes this novel unputdownable to me is the almost detective work that the two academics, Roland Michel and Maud Bailey, undertake. Possession is full of pleasant surprises, and it has all the ingredients to make it a page-turner. You might have guessed that the novel is also concerned with the love story between the two academics, Roland and Maud. And as a former academic myself, I just couldn't resist the elements of academic satire in this novel. Now, who would I recommend Possession to? Well, to everyone who loves reading, really, but I think you will particularly enjoy this novel if you read Victorian literature. Possession won the Booker Prize in 1990 and it became a bestseller, but I just don't hear enough people talk about it these days. The next book is The Adoption Papers by Jackie Kay. You might be surprised to hear that this book is not a novel but a poetry collection, but before you skip this part and go to the next book, please hear what I have to say about it, because you can almost read The Adoption Papers as a novel because it is what critics call a narrative poem. Jackie Kay is a Scottish writer who was adopted when she was a small child, and in The Adoption Papers, she reimagines her adoption process and her childhood in 1980s Britain. The Adoption Papers is made up of 17 poems, and there are 3 voices: that of the birth mother, that of the adoptive mother, and that of the adopted child, Jackie herself. Now, Jackie Kay's birth parents are a black Nigerian man and a white Scottish woman, and in the poem, we see that it was only when her future adoptive mother, who is white, told the agency that she didn't care about skin color that she was even told about the child. Before that, the agency had claimed that they had no available babies for her. The Adoptive Papers deals with race, but also with social class, sexual identity, and even the AIDS crisis against a backdrop of Thatcher's Britain. The next book is A Heart So White by Javier Marías, which first came out in Spanish as Un Corazón Tan Blanco in 1992, but there is an excellent English translation by Margaret Costa. Now, this novel has one of the most perfect plots I have ever encountered. The protagonist narrator of A Heart So White is a writer and translator named Juan Ranz. Now, when the novel begins, he has recently gotten married to a woman named Luisa, and while they are on their honeymoon in Cuba, an unknown woman confuses him with someone else. Juan is very curious, which makes him a great narrator, and he wants to find out about his family's biggest secret that involves a suicide that took place before he was born. So he uses his wife Luisa and her friendship with his father to investigate what happened in the past. I guess I could tell you a little bit more about the plot of this novel without spoiling it, but I think I'll leave it here for now. I read on a New York Times review that A Heart So White has elements of Henry James and Marcel Proust. Now, if I hadn't read this novel yet, that would be enough for me to jump on it. But if those literary references scare you, do not worry, because A Heart So White is a hugely enjoyable page-turner that became an international bestseller in the 1990s, and it still holds up. It is probably one of the best novels written in Spanish that I have ever read, and it works just as well in English translation. Okay, next we have Pnin by Vladimir Nabokov. Now, most people have heard about Nabokov's controversial novel Lolita, which I have reviewed already here on my channel, but Pnin is a completely different novel. Pnin is a comic novel, an academic satire about a Russian professor living in the US in the 1950s. It is a very short novel. It only has 7 chapters, so you could read it in 1 or 2 sittings as well. Now, Pnin is a funny novel, right? Parts of it are hilarious, but the backdrop is extremely serious. After all, Pnin, the character, is a political exile in America with a tragic past in Russia. Now, despite all of that, Pnin constantly pines for his country, and he has trouble fitting in the US and in the small college he teaches in. Americans often mispronounce his name, and he's baffled by how they live. So this is a classic fish out of water narrative. I do have a soft spot for academic satires, as I explained when I talked about Possession a bit ago in this video, but I think any kind of reader would have a great time with Pnin. I think this novel could be also a great introduction to Nabokov's writing. It is short, it is funny, and like everything else he wrote, it is masterful. You will breeze through it. And then we have Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. This is probably not the kind of novel that everyone would enjoy, but it is so good that I hope you would at least give it a chance. I'm going to describe the plot of the novel briefly now, but with no spoilers, okay? So there is this 76-year-old congregational reverend named John Ames who writes an account of his life addressed to his 7-year-old son. The reverend's wife, Lila, is obviously a lot younger than him, and he believes that he'll die before his son is old enough to keep many memories of him, and that is why he decides to write a long letter, which is how this novel is structured. Gilead, by the way, is the name of the fictional small town in Iowa where the Reverend and his family and other characters in the novel live. Now, I am aware that this plot summary probably does not make the novel sound particularly compelling, but please trust me on this one. John Ames was born in 1880, okay, so he has lived through a lot if you think about it, and he wants his son to know about it, and all of that is in the novel. Now, since its publication, Gilead has spawned a series. At the time of making this video, there are 4 novels in total. There is Gilead from 2004, Home from 2008, Lila from 2014, and Jack from 2020. Each of those novels focuses mainly on a different character and their point of view. I have read all of them except Jack, which I am planning to do in the next couple of months, but I can say that I have loved all of them so far. Now, you can read Gilead on its own, but if you want to read the others, I would still start with Gilead and read the rest of the series in order. But be assured that Gilead stands on its own as a novel, okay? Don't you think that you are buying into a whole series if you pick it up. You can just read it and stop there, no problem. I don't even know if Robinson had already mined the idea of writing a series, but there is nothing in Gilead that would suggest that to me. So you can read it on its own and have a perfectly satisfying reading experience. I know I did, until I read the following book. So, as I said, I have read each of the novels after intervals of many years, and I have never felt compelled to read them as soon as they were published, which also explains why I haven't read Jack yet. Perhaps I think it would be more accurate to say that these novels are a sequence rather than a series. Marilynne Robinson writes such beautiful prose, and her characters are so multifaceted and fascinating that even though my own background is a world away from what I imagine a small Congregationalist community in the American Midwest must be like, I still loved her books and recommend them to anyone who would listen. For more book recommendations, you can check out the video linked to on your screen right now, or check out my weekly videos on my channel. See you soon.